I graduated 4 years ago, and I know that when I was studying, I appreciated to hear from people who'd recently graduated kind of about their approach when they were at school and what they did just afterwards. So yeah, I grew up in Glasgow in Scotland, and as a teenager I was involved quite a lot in kind of underground music, and I used to write a fanzine. It was this thing at the start of the 90s called Riot Girl. I don't know if you remember, but it was a whole kind of wave of young women and men as well, kind of slightly kind of repoliticising kind of underground music, independent music at a point when it had got quite macho, you know, kind of all these guitar guys. And that was fantastic. That was great to be involved in something like that before going to art school, because you know, to realise already when you're quite young that whatever you're interested in, it doesn't have to be about, you know, having a huge knowledge about art history. It's more about an approach and a practice, and being confident that what you're interested in is relevant. But of course, the problems with all these underground scenes is that they're exactly the same as any kind of social situation. They're full of hierarchies, and they're full of ambitious people, and they're full of people that want to be part of something, and it can be quite lazy. And so I kind of got quite sick quickly of a lot of the sort of feminist discourse, or even the music that was involved. And just after I started art school, I got involved with an American photographer called Richard Kern, who was a filmmaker who I really admired. And when I met him, he was taking a lot of pictures of young girls, basically, to make money in the porn industry, but showing them as art as well. And I got involved with him, and that was really interesting to be doing it parallel with studying art or having an art practice, because it kind of it showed another system and another kind of value system and hierarchy. Completely different from producing art, and also as an individual and as a woman, it kind of tested certain ideas about yourself and barriers and boundaries, and so for me it was really, I really approached it as an artist to kind of learn something about myself, and it was also kind of a way of just saying like, well, there's no going back now. All these images are out there in the world, and I'm going to have to learn to deal with the consequences of that. This is some other work by Richard. Now, he was also coming from a kind of underground scene who had, by kind of, not by accident, but for his own, for certain reasons, had started to show in galleries or whatever, purely, basically for money. And so kind of getting to know him, who had a completely different approach to making art as well, was great. Now, one of the big influences on my kind of worldview when I was younger was this band called Throbbing Gristle. This is the four of them here. They're a band who were kind of on the margins of punk in London in the late 70s, but they were the kind of founders of industrial music. And the group was basically this collaboration between four different individuals. I was particularly in love with the woman. It's an artist called Cozy Fanny Tutti, and she had worked as a pornographic model to finance their project, their lives. And she also would re-show the images of herself in porn magazines. And she's completely excluded from any kind of feminist art history discourse. You know, she was dealing with identity and kind of this kind of thing round about the same time as Cindy Sherman, but because she just had nothing to do with the fine art, she's ignored. I guess my work has always been around, coming from exactly the same attitude as doing a fanzine. It's kind of putting different things together, and it's about magpieing different cultural references. And I guess all the stuff that I'm interested in, it's not that I'm working with it because I particularly love it. I guess I'm working with it because it's useful for what I need to say. And I'm always interested in the way that through juxtaposition and kind of layering of different signifiers and the suggestion that means that meaning can come out and it can be suggested rather than just stated. So for instance, this is a painting called Subsidy, and it was just trying to kind of bastardize a mixture of Barbara Kruger and with the approach of Gerhard Richter with this kind of photorealistic take, but then it's an image from Communist Gymnastics Annual. So it's really about using art history as just fodder to say what I try to say, and it's maybe about having not particularly a lot of respect for the people that are considered classic or idols. I know Gerhard Richter in particular is kind of good taste master. This is work by Art and Language, a conceptual art group that have been going since the 70s. This is a portrait of Lenin in the style of Jackson Pollock. And this for me has the same kind of use of juxtaposition or and layering that I like in my own work. When I studied in Germany, I was only there for 3 months. But the studying in Germany was such a reflection on the art practice in Great Britain. It's just so they've got such a different relationship with painting, especially expressionistic painting and gesture, which just it isn't discussed in Scottish art in the moment at all. And at the time, I was really into this band Depeche Mode, who were just detested in Britain, but in Germany you can go there and they have these incredible Depeche Mode nights where they play nothing but Depeche Mode, and this was like about 1997, 98, before a kind of this 80s revival monoculture. And so for me, this kind of different, this German take on British pop culture was like my interest in German expressionism. It was the same misunderstanding or the way that ideas kind of transmute across geography. And it's the misunderstanding which ends up being interesting. And so I made a series of paintings on expressionistic canvases that I found in the skip in the rubbish at the college. So in a way it's a kind of dusty, unwanted approach to painting mixed with a type of music that just seemed completely redundant at the time, but I loved. This is from a canvas that I stole from the art school in Gdansk. I work a lot with a Polish painter called Paulina Loska, who actually studied in Chicago for about 4 years. But she was at Gdansk at the time, and she let me into the storeroom to get some paintings. And of course, studying in Germany was kind of introduced. I've always had an interest in totalitarian aesthetics. And if you go to Germany, then you can go to Berlin and you can see all the Nazi architecture, etc. I mean, I guess why I'm drawn to totalitarian aesthetics and art is because, you know, in that whole intense period in the 20th century, this kind of absolute malaise of modernism, it was the politicians who were the real shapers of culture and the artists. And art was absolutely just there to serve a political aim. And so it was absolutely voluptuous and it's gorgeous. And so, yeah, so it's art that's kind of serving another use. And it's got its responsibility is kind of put to the side. And its kind of relationship to the individual, the whole way that it's kind of the individual is posed to be kind of in opposition to a collective. And a great symbol of that for me is the Olympics, because the Olympics are there supposed to symbolise a kind of neutrality and a universal spirit. But as we all know, the Olympics is absolutely a site for sexual, political, whatever intrigue. And but the aesthetics of it are amazing, and because it's kind of supposed to be this neutral thing, all the whole period of the kind of golden age of the Cold War and terrorism in the late 70s, early 80s, the way that the 1980s Olympics in Moscow was in opposition to the one in Los Angeles in 1984. It's just a real kind of fantastic clash of aesthetics and cultures. And so for me, it was a really good shorthand to talk about all the things I was concerned with at the time. Yeah, this kind of malaise. And whenever I've shown my paintings, or at the time, I always showed them in a kind of collage, a montage of different images, so that all the different kind of visual languages and the contents would kind of mix together to create a mood rather than say anything explicit. And I hope that the incongruousness of the images would just give across this sense of something rather than being very explicit. This was in a show, a group show that I did just after art school in a gallery in Norwich. And this was my first solo show after I graduated, which was in December 2000. After I finished at art school, I moved back to Glasgow because I studied in this small town in the north of Scotland. And the whole thing about this small town was that there was absolutely no kind of inherent culture there to engage with at all. It was such a kind of boring town. And this is why I developed such a strong kind of fantasy life, and was studying all this Eastern European and German aesthetics. But then when I moved back to Glasgow, which is where I'm from, it's a very different situation. We've got an art history and a social history and a culture which is really rich. And part of that is there's an architect, Charles Rennie Mackintosh, Art Nouveau architect, who designed the art school in Glasgow where my father works. So of course I hated it as a child. And it was only when I moved back to Glasgow that I started to realise the actual quality of his architecture and his thinking, the the humanity and the kind of proto-feminism in it, and the symbolism. And but in Glasgow, he's used as a kind of symbol of the city, the same way that Gaudi is used in Barcelona or something. So you get him on tea towels and mugs and all this kind of crap. And so I kind of introduced him into this kind of mix along with the totalitarian stuff, because it was about the same point of when images become so kind of hackneyed and symbolic of a kind of social PR, but do actually have some kind of content. And just after I came back to Glasgow, I curated an exhibition with a friend of mine called Keith Farquhar in an artist-run space called Transmission. And the show was called It May Be a Year of 13 Moons, but it's still the Year of Culture. Now, Glasgow was the European Capital of Culture in 1990, and this was a really kind of important part in the city's history because it was the first time you could actually buy a cappuccino, and it always had this history of being and this reputation of being a really tough, dangerous city. But everything changed around that time, and people started coming there. It was a kind of tourist destination. They gave this a bit like the I Love New York. Glasgow had a Glasgow's Miles Better kind of campaign to try and cheer the place up. And so, but it was actually an important point in the city's art history as well, because in the 80s, art had been a bastion of male expressionist painters, people like Stephen Campbell, postmodern painting. And then after 1990, there was an absolute break with that, and so people like Douglas Gordon and people that were very influenced by the work of Lawrence Wiener and conceptual art kind of took over, and all this painting was just consigned to the dustbin. So we made an exhibition that we really wanted to play with this weird shift in aesthetics, And we featured one of these 80s painters, Stephen Campbell, who had never shown in this alternative space because he usually shows in commercial galleries. We basically turned the artist-run underground space into what looked like quite a chic commercial gallery. And I designed these doors so that when you entered the building, you could only come into the show through opening one of these doors. A bit like these, you get these books, if you pick up the sword, turn to page 52. But you still ended up in the same space. And you actually had to touch the paintings to get in, so they got really grubby. And also I was the only woman in the show, and so I liked the idea of making this little kind of vestibule so you could get in and confront all these bombastic males. And we also gave the Transmission Gallery a bit of a makeover as well. We did a new sign for it to make it look a bit like an Irish pub. And around about the same time, when I worked with this guy, Keith, who was my boyfriend at the time, we called ourselves Charisma. And he'd been part of an artist group called Deutsche Britische Freundschaft with a German guy in London. And Glasgow has an art fair, which is very, very provincial, either white spaces like the Transmission or the Modern Institute, kind of contemporary spaces, or old farts, pictures of dogs and flowers and things. And we pretended to be a gallery and managed to get some funding from the Scottish Arts Council and did a stand of our own with the work of ours and our friends. But we deliberately did it to look a bit like an old fart space. So they had this like leather biker jacket made out of steel in the corner and these kind of oil paint, psychedelic paintings. And these photographs are an English photographer called Josephine Pride. Very, just kind of conceptual photography, so it really looked ambiguous as to what exactly it was or why it was. But of course I forgot I had to sit there for 3 days, and it's horrible sitting at an art fair. I couldn't sell anything to anyone, It was I didn't realise beforehand. And never again. We sold nothing. And I guess because I'm just interested in the whole idea of the transaction and the value system in art, and the way, if it's art, especially if you work as an artist with commercial galleries and you see the whole, how much you even charge for a painting. It's such a strange structure. This was a metal screen that had, basically inspired by going to Eastern Europe. They have a lot of this decorative metal work there. But this is a screen, and it was decorated with pound signs and a map of Scotland. And so as well as my practice of painting, I'd worked for a bit with this guy Keith, but not anymore. We don't go on anymore, as usual, with boyfriends and girlfriends. I also work with this Polish girl, Paulina Orlowska, who I met in 1998 while on exchange. And we started kind of showing together quite soon after we met. And then kind of by accident, we started to make work together. This was the first painting that we ever made together. We organised a show in Gdansk at the start of 2000. And I was just working on a wall painting, and she said, "Oh, you should do it like this." And I said, "Oh, well, you show me." And then it happened. I never expected that, probably through quite bad experiences playing in bands, where you just don't get on with the people. It's so lucky to meet someone that you can really you absolutely understand each other. It's a complete partnership, and that's what we have. We've got a really good working relationship. Working collaboratively is great for your practice on your own, because it just takes you out of yourself a bit and lets you be a bit freer about your ideas, basically, because the responsibility is shared. And yeah, it's really good. And we're both very inspired by the whole history of mural painting. That's in Gdansk. This is an artist from Glasgow called Alistair Gray, who's done a lot of murals around Glasgow. He's also a writer. Now, in 2001, Paulina and I did a wall painting in Gdansk, which was on the edge of the Solidarity shipyards. which, as you probably know, was the kind of start of the solidarity movement, which propelled the fall of communism. It was 100 metres long by 2 metres high, and we did it in 10 days. And we worked with existing kind of posters and graffiti that was on the wall. And we also invited some local graffiti artists to kind of give us a hand. And so it was really about all the different manifestations of wall paintings, from political murals to graffiti to advertising, all kind of social projects. And working with the graffiti artists was good, but it wasn't so easy because they didn't have the same attitude to wall painting that we had. They were actually a bit angry that we'd painted over their work, or they weren't so free about it, which kind of shows how narrow graffiti is. And it was graffitied like the morning after we finished it, and I've seen it recently and it looks unbelievable. It's just it's so covered in graffiti, it looks fantastic. This is a lino print using a Scottish banknote as a kind of surrogate mural. And I think I'm especially interested in, say, the sculpture that came about in France after the revolution, where you get figurative sculpture which really manages to combine the figures of real people, say like generals or war heroes, with people that like a personification. So you get a woman who symbolises France, and then people that symbolise a kind of social type, for instance, a student or something. And the way that the figure becomes that embodiment of so many different things I'm really interested in. This is a painting called Global Joy, and here I tried to do a painting which was kind of about this friction between the individual and the collective that I mentioned before. The figures are all taken from, the girl right at the end with the gun, that's Gerhard Richter's daughter, Betty, who I've always liked because she's really stylish. She's got good shoes and she looks like something from a David Lynch film or something. And the other figures, a lot of them are taken from this theatre group in Berlin called the Ratten Sieben, which was a homeless theatre group who I used to go and see, and they were great. The audience would all be homeless, they were homeless. And the play was all them just arguing, my childhood was more bourgeois than yours. We had 2 cars. We had 3 holidays a year. And I don't know, do you know this album, Daydream Nation by Sonic Youth? Because Gerhard Richter did the cover for it. And it's just this very classic picture of a candle, which really sums up the kind of classicness of the songs. It's this kind of straight down the line, underground, tasteful album. Now, Pauline and I have travelled a lot. We travelled in Russia a bit, and I found a bootleg of the Daydream Nation album. And usually, and this is company Offon that does them, and usually they just have these kind of pencil drawings to approximate David Bowie or the Stooges or whatever. But because this one was a painting of a candle, they redid it with just a photograph of a candle, and it looked like a Christmas card or something. It was amazing. And they completely butchered the album because it's 2 discs. And so they'd reduced it down to 1 disc by just chopping off the last song on every side and then just not even putting the last side on. And but I just thought that the kind of audacity, that great that transmutation of that image, could just in a photograph of a candle, it was just it had so much panache, amazing. And so in this painting, there's people kind of sitting around listening to Daydream Nation, and also they look a bit like they symbolise a kind of idea of a marginal underground community. There's a guy putting up a gig poster, and they've got brothel creepers or whatever. But it's in this overdetermined format of a socialist realist painting. And this is a portrait of Keith. It's kind of based on a picture of Napoleon. I also did a portrait of my sister, which I stupidly forgot to bring a slide of. But it's basically my sister studies physics and philosophy. She's a real big brain. And she lent me her Idiot's Guide to Philosophy book. And on the chapter on Nietzsche, I had a portrait of Napoleon when it was him in his Naval Academy studying, and his beautiful Roman profile is falling over a map of Europe, symbolising his kind of his relationship in history. And so I did this whole series of portraits of people I knew with their shadows falling over parts of the world where I thought they might have an effect. Kind of symbolises the potential. This is that guy Alistair Gray that I mentioned before, this Glasgow artist and writer. I curated a big exhibition last year in a Kunstverein in Braunschweig, and the show was called The Best Book About Pessimism I Ever Read, because he wrote the best book about pessimism I ever read. It's called NAK. And we showed some of his books and films, and also there was work by some other older Scottish artists and just a lot of my friends. And the whole idea of the show was to kind of, just about all the work was figurative. And I was thinking about the way that in Germany you do get such a kind of fine discourse about painting, that people can be expressionistic and kind of gestural, and it's not a immediate supposition that they're just macho or kind of Sunday painters. And I wondered if you could do the same thing, only with kind of narrative painting or very kind of illustrational work. And because the Kunstverein is just this beautiful space, this is the work of two artists from Glasgow, Joanne Tatham and Tom O'Sullivan. The whole subject of the show was the artist, and I thought about people walking through the space and being figures inside this beautiful space, and the work being a kind of very literal interpretation of the brain or intelligence or artistic thought. In Glasgow, I'm part of an artist studio called Flourish that I'm a founding member of. There's about 7 of us. And a couple of years ago, we managed to make a video projector, and some different kind of stuff fall off the back of a lorry. And we use it to put on a bunch of evenings once a year with film and live music and performance and poetry. And I do all the advertising for them. I make silkscreen posters and then put a sticker with all the information. And I get some funding from the Scottish Arts Council for it. And I always apply as an individual. I just really think it's your obligation as an artist to use the kind of freedom given to fine artists to bypass some of the more bureaucratic parts of the art world. So for instance, me as a curator, I feel like I'm given a lot of freedom to be as weird as I want to be, because I'm an artist, not a curator. So when I apply for money for these nights, I don't apply as a curator. I apply as an individual, as if organising these things is part of my practice, and then they give me the money and I don't have to explain anything to anyone. So it's an awful lot of freedom. Art has got to be exploited for sociable and kind of voluptuous ends. So this is one of the nights. This is Keith reading some poetry. We have live music. Another poster. And because I make the posters myself, we've got the freedom to just decide that week what we're going to do, and then I just fly post them around. So it's absolute freedom. It's such a difference than if you work in an institution and you've got, PR departments and you're accountable and people have got to pay to get in. We could just do exactly what we want. But at the same time, it means we've got to be responsible. We've had people try and set the room on fire. So if you try to encourage a kind of relaxed atmosphere, it can go too far. This is a performance by Paulina and I called Oblique Composition. She makes a human letter, and I play a kind of response, a refrain on the clarinet, and we spell out United Colours of Benetton. This was a performance by Marc Shamovitz, and it's actually a recreation of a performance he did in the late 70s. We had a young guy to play the part of him, because he's an old man now, so we had this young boy playing him. This is a mural in a bar in Glasgow. It's a bar that's been run by people that have always been doing great stuff in Glasgow. Whenever I played the first gigs or anything like that as a teenager, it was always in their venues, and they've now got this beautiful big space. And yeah, I did a mural in the premises. And this is the Venice Biennial this year. This is the sad bit of the story. This was a complete disaster. I had real misgivings about taking part. Of course, you're really flattered to be asked to take part in such a big show. But they asked me to do this big wall painting, and I won't go into the details, but the whole situation was very difficult. And I thought I would do something that would be about spectacle, so that when people are standing in this great big hall and they'd look up and they'd go, oh. So it's about this sense of it being kind of something undefined. But then when we went to the opening, the room was absolutely full of other works, and that it looked like it was part of the same thing. And I just realised that institutional critique just doesn't work, or didn't work in my case. So I was very depressed. This is a show from February this year called Brian Eno, that was at the NAK Neuer Aachener Kunstverein in Germany. It was in two parts, and the lower part was this trompe-l'oeil mural installation. There's an artist who does some stuff in Chicago, actually. I saw today a guy called Richard Haas that does these trompe-l'oeil paintings on the side of buildings. I'm a big fan of his, so it's great to see some stuff in the flesh. But basically, the space is very cold, and because I've been involved in all these kind of more sociable things, like organising the nights in the studio or working with Paulina, I was very unsure about how to approach doing a solo exhibition. And I thought the only way I could be honest, to having been involved in this kind of collective thing, was I couldn't try and somehow cram it into the gallery. The only way I could mention it would be somehow to present it in its absence. So there was this installation, and then displayed on the red walls was the posters from the Flourish Nights. And so I hoped that the visitor would really get a sense of the emptiness of this room. The mural could be it's an idea, it could be just a piece of interior design. And I guess like the 13 Moons show, it was about this clash of aesthetics with the 1980s. And I wanted the mural to exist in this kind of world of interior design, and especially because this kind of mural painting alludes to so many different things, democracy. I always think of Versace and kind of over-the-top gay aesthetics. And it's about a spatial trick, but it's also to kind of, it implies money and wealth as well. And because the show was called Brian Eno, that was a very simplistic and literal idea of just magpieing someone's name for your own use. I wanted the installation to be so kind of two-dimensional and thin. It was about a suggestion of a situation rather than being anything real. And displayed, you can't really see it, but there was a little plastic container that had some black and white photocopies of an article from about 1981 that was in a magazine called Interiors magazine. And it was about Brian Ferry and his flat in Notting Hill. And it's this really important bit of important article, because it was a big shock at the time, because people just didn't expect that he would live the way that he did. He had this beautiful, tasteful Georgian, mock Georgian apartment. He had 2 types of taffeta curtains, Victorian painting. People presumed he would have kind of Mickey Mouse telephone and gold discs on the wall and fun fur, because he was this pop star, but actually was extremely tasteful. And so it was about being somehow, the friction of it not being of its time or somehow out of sync with the aesthetics of the time. And also Brian Ferry, Brian Eno, the kind of clash of their different career paths. I mean, there was the first time I'd ever made this kind of mural, so the actual practical, the way it worked out in actuality was quite different from the way I intended. It came out looking much more cartoonish and much more like Giorgio de Chirico or something, or even Liechtenstein. I thought it'd be a lot more subtle than that, but I'd never made one before, so of course it didn't look real. And I learned the technique of the marble for the columns, just in a kind of teach yourself DIY home decoration. And so in a way, I mean, I'm interested in this marble technique because it's about abstraction, but then it's about a kind of very rigid technique in abstraction. And if I think about someone like Brian Eno, and he talks about ambient music in terms of it being like taking a figure out of a painting. When you have a figure in a painting, then you use that figure to measure by. And so somehow if you take the human voice or a kind of meter, a beat out of music, somehow it takes away that judgment. But the thing, Brian Eno is such a huge star. He's such an ego. He's such a kind of brand that I think it's a conceit to think that he can take himself out of the picture. And so for me, the marble is about this kind of confinement or the lie of abstraction. The column headings were done with spray paint through a stencil, and I liked the way that it was a bit like graffiti or something, which is so incongruous with the actual image. So the exhibition was in 2 parts. And this was the upstairs. It's a kind of bad slide, but this was a really dark brown neon. Now the portraits on the wall, it was very dark, and so you had to come right up to see the faces of the people. And they're all portraits of either friends or people I know, all chosen in a very small criteria. The men were mostly chosen because they're early balding, the sort of young, good-looking guys who are going bald, which I like, because it's this kind of vulnerability, and men tend to display quite a sort of feminine vanity when it comes to hair loss. And they've all in this 3/4 view, which is important for me because it's halfway between the kind of officiousness of a profile, like on a coin or a stamp, and a full-on facial shot like a mugshot or a passport photograph. And they were all chosen because they were all from at some point, they looked like they were from at some point in the 20th century, but you couldn't exactly tell when. And a lot of them were caricatures because I wanted these to exist, a bit like the mural downstairs, to have this double life, or the posters also, they've all got this double life which rests in functionality. The mural it's just a mural, but it can also be interior design. The posters are just posters, but they're also advertisements for the evenings. And caricature's got this, it's not just drawing, it's got a double thing. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it has it. And it's actually really the most honest way that I can make marks as well, because it's my natural hand from doing these comic books and fanzines and things. I've got this stupid kind of cartoonish style. But you really had to get right up close to the faces to see them. It kind of enforced intimacy. And this is the project that Lorelei mentioned. It was a bar in Warsaw that ran for 1 month in May, and Paulina and I did it through the help of the foundation Galerie Foxall, which is an independent space there. We we were originally invited to do something with a guy called Łukasz Gotycia, who's an art historian in Warsaw, and he's got an interest in Polish design and has a kind of collection of modernist Polish ceramics and this kind of thing. And because Paulina had worked before kind of curating the collection of a museum, and I've got an interest in design and art history, they thought that us three could kind of work together on something, but it just didn't work. He's not a fine artist, and he had a kind of rigidity. I mean, if you're an artist, you've got to be able to be flexible and find solutions in different paths, and it just didn't work out at all. But through the discussions, we thought that a way to approach this, the kind of pooled aesthetics of all of us, would be to do a social space, to do a bar, which would then be an excuse to make murals and posters and invite people to play. But it wouldn't stop at that point, which so many artists do, which is to allude into a kind of underground or a social situation. We really would have to take it further and actually do it properly. It would put all the demands that come from running a social space on it. We worked in the bar. I've never worked in a bar before. It was a big shock. We had to care for the bar, clean the place, design everything. We got all the furniture secondhand that we customised. It was all graffitied by the people that came. We had homemade vodka from the countryside, a friend of Paulina's uncle's. And so we had this amazing moonshine vodka in lots of different flavours, because it was very important for us for the space to be absolutely autonomous in this time, at this point when art is so, I mean, it's sponsored by companies, or there's always some kind of commercial tie-in with any exhibition. We wanted to have absolute control, so we had branded goods completely to a minimum. We had one brand of beer, and we sold some cigarettes called Kim, both chosen for their aesthetic girlishness. And that's all. And then we had the homemade vodka. Now, we were thinking a lot about the idea of a salon and how kind of what a dusty model of counterculture that is. But you think of, Impressionist France, and there was certainly a big culture of it under communism. But we wanted to allude to that kind of idea of avant-garde, which is pre-punk, because especially in Britain, everything kind of starts with punk. And we wanted to go back from that, or situationism, we wanted to go further back. And we were thinking about the women in these Impressionist paintings of Toulouse-Lautrec and Manet and Picasso, and the way that the women are used to signify social change and sort of sexual liberation. But we wanted to kind of not give them a voice, but we wanted to kind of become those women. We were the women in the Folie Bergère standing behind the bar. We wanted to create a place that the absinthe drinker could come and be miserable on her own. And a friend actually came up with a defining phrase. We wanted to create a bachelorette machine. And so the whole aesthetic was very girly. We had the Macintosh curtains, piano. Oh, sorry. We had the vodka in a massive perfume bottle that we poured it from. And us ourselves, we had outfits that were designed by a friend of mine with that kind of post-impressionist thing in mind. There's a vodka. Yep, everything got absolutely destroyed. But this is the thing, I'd never worked in a bar before, and the whole thing of dealing with the neighbours, the police, being polite to boring guys, with drunk people. I've only ever worked as like a life model or in washing dishes. I've never had to be nice to people, so it was a real shock. Also because we spent all that time preparing what the space was going to look like. On the first night after the place had opened, we were just like, like, you know, covered in these wrinkles, just like, oh God, we've got to be here for a month. It was an absolute emotional and physical investment. And I'm a big fan of Mike Kelly, and I mean, all his work with the soft toys, which is about dealing with this kind of system of worth, which is about hours of love and care put into a kind of folk object. And it felt a bit like that for us. The only failure in this project, the failure wouldn't be if the place looked crap or if people didn't come or whatever, because that was just the reality. It was an experiment. And so that wasn't the failure. The failure would be just how kind of honest we were to it, or how much we actually engaged with the art world, or how much responsibility we really took. And also, of course, how faithful we are to the reality of it afterwards, because it only existed for a month and it was mostly just people from Warsaw that came. So then the way it has this life afterwards is very important. And we had concerts. And a refined clientele. We had a total mixture of people. It was a bit like a bar in a station, because it was off the equivalent of like the high street, the main shopping street in Warsaw, which you couldn't do in Scotland because there's such a violent drinking culture. But yeah, we had students and actors and people just passing through, and neighbours, people from abroad. And I think people kind of did appreciate that, the buck stopped with us. If they were an arsehole, we were the ones that had to clean up the vomit and the glass. And it certainly didn't feel like an art project. And the reason we could put so much investment into it, because it was just for a month. If it was any longer, we couldn't have done it. And we had this incredible building. We rented the Society for the Friends of Fine Art, which is an old, unused gallery. It's kind of off the map. And so, of course, because it was in this gallery, whenever the police turned up, we could say, oh, we have another opening party. And at one point, the police arrived at about 4 o'clock in the morning, and they just burst in, and everyone just stared at them, and then someone said, oh, we don't speak Polish. We're all from England. And because we'd had some sponsorship from the British Council to get some of the people over, one person I was with said, hello, I'm from the British Council. And the police thought that was like the Foreign Office or something, and they just got scared and left. So it's just art has to be there to be exploited. The general public's misunderstanding or their fear of conceptual art and art concepts, it's got to be used. And the same, I was making posters every week for the concerts. Just in the bathtub and in the kitchen. And we got sent a lot of music by friends to play in the bar. The police came about eight or 9 times. We had a koczaka on our back. A koczaka is the Polish word for a middle-aged woman who has cats instead of love. And we had a koczaka who was trying to shut us down. And this is the last project. This is the show that's on at the Tate, Britain at the moment. The show is called MMIV, which is the Roman numerals for 2004. One of the lasting effects of doing that bar in Poland for me was being around girls in Warsaw who've got an absolutely different take on gender politics and feminism than the one that I experienced in the West. It's basically much more urgent, and the culture is just so different over there that it's they have this approach to feminism which you just don't get over here. It's much more kind of straight down the line and necessary, and it was really refreshing to be around. But of course, if you spend any time in the city or if you go to the countryside, you see the kind of, what's the word, the results of this political shift over the last 13 years. people have gone from being fucked over by one political system to being fucked over by the one coming in. The East is basically considered a kind of reserve army of labour for the West, and part of this is the sex industry. La Strada is a charity in Warsaw that they lobby Parliament and they do education and they help actual women who've been victims of trafficking. Poland is a particular situation because it's a city of the people leave from to go to the West. They also come there from places like the Ukraine and they travel through because of the existing grassroots networks of communities of Poles all over the world. It's just the easiest thing for this kind of transaction of human beings. And so I was invited to show at the Tate, and I don't know how much you know about it, but the Tate has gone through this amazing branding over the last few years. It's not the Tate Gallery anymore, it's Tate Britain and Tate Modern with this kind of horrible diffused logo. And they've actually got a magazine called Tate Magazine, which they sold to Condé Nast as just a name. They have nothing to do with it anymore. It's a brand, and that's the way it is in Britain. It's the way it's going to be in the rest of Europe over the next few years. But I wanted to just kind of assert something as an individual shown in such a huge institution, and I thought that one way to do that would be if I could just have someone else's logo, even bigger than the Tate's, on the invitation. That would somehow give me the kind of autonomy that I wanted in the show, which I thought would be so difficult within such a kind of tight institution. And so the idea of making the show for charity became a way for me to, on one hand, try and assert something against the institution or within the institution. It was also a kind of a way of thinking about the way that socially engaged art looks and smells a certain way, and the idea of something being for charity is such a kind of Dickensian, old-fashioned construct of being socially accountable. I thought I could use it. And then also the charity bit is an absolutely irony-free zone. This is a charity whose work I completely agree with, especially because of things like this very gentle, protected brush with the sex industry. When I was a bit younger, I've got an absolutely irrational over-identification with these women, purely out of the lack of opportunities I've forced into these situations. And the way that the sex industry, maybe over the last few years, it's kind of glamorised a lot more than it should be. And the work of someone like that guy Richard Kern, he's a real symbol of the shift in social tastes to do with porn or things like fetish culture as well. It's just moved into the mainstream in a way. And I think there's nothing wrong with the sex industry when women get the money that, if they're in control of the situation, but in these situations they're not. So when you walked into the gallery, there was all this information about the charity, and I made a little wall painting. So it looked like kind of gallery information, but it was actually a piece of work. And the space was almost empty. On the wall was this year planner for next year, which it's handmade, it's kind of offset print and then hand silk screened. And I made these partly so that I could give them to my friends for them to get their shit together and work hard and be organised. I'm going to give them away at the Flourish Nights this year to get people on the case. But then also to kind of symbolise the absolute melancholy of work. An artist is a cultural worker. And in juxtaposition with different pieces in the room, that the melancholy of this empty year planner, the whole of next year, and in that kind of shade of the idea of sex workers, I wanted it to be about this kind of, this fatigue of work. I mean, also myself, I was a bit knackered after all these shows, like the show at Venice and whatever. I think it's really an artist's right to fail and an artist's right to feel a bit tired. And the best work for me is the work which is honest about that. in my own experiences. I mean, when I did approaching the show, I thought it was going to be a disaster because I felt so kind of frazzled. But it just shows that if you're approaching something and you're the most together and organised and this is what it's about, it doesn't, doesn't mean it's going to be a good show. With this show and the one in Aachen, both situations, I was very unclear about what I was doing. I didn't know, and in the end, that vulnerability and the honesty to that state of mind ended up being the best thing about the show. So yeah, year planner. And then also some bullshit to make it look like a show. There was a kind of lino print of a desolate scene in Glasgow and then a black and white charcoal drawing. I mean, usually my work's very figurative. It's about human beings and it's about society. But then I wanted that to be absolutely absent in the show, so it's only this thought in the back of your mind of these women that the charity's involved in. They would be the human beings in the show. They're just really bleak views of Glasgow from about 1980. And it was really important for me that the publicity was very specific, specifically mediocre, because usually they have these big pizzazz colour posters for these shows. It's in a space called Art Now, which is this little room right at the back of the Tate where they show young art in, which is completely lost in the whole kind of cogs of the machine of the Tate. But I had to fight to get that to look that shit. They had to put that through their development office. They pretended they couldn't find the font that I wanted. It was really important for me that it looked like a brochure in a kind of horrible health centre for, AIDS or. And so it was all about these shades of a certain sensitivity to mediocrity, shabbiness, and so you would get a sense of thinking about how that would be made if it was in a completely other space, as my attempt to undermine what I see as the problems of institutions and a whole approach of being a professional. And so as well as these, there was a room at the back and we showed a film also called Oblique Composition. And this is a kind of still from the film. The film is made by Paulina and I, and it's from a performance that we did in this space at the start of the year. Now, the performance was a bit of a disaster. It just ended up being really pretentious. But the film, we could use it as material for a film. And the only reason I really showed the film was because it had this beautiful soundtrack. One of the people we met in Warsaw that played a concert was this prepared piano performer called Marcin Dutka. And I really wanted to have a soundtrack in the show, but I didn't think I could just put some speakers in the corner. I just really wanted, as you walked around this empty room and see this empty year planner, for them to be some melancholy, icy piano music in the background. So basically we showed a film just so that the sound would bleed through into the room, the same way that hopefully the thought of these poor girls would, bleed through into your consciousness as well. But the film is about 10 minutes long and it's got this soundtrack. And in the film, Paulina and I play kind of caricatured roles of working women. She plays an architect and I play an artist. And in the film, basically she's working and then I come in and do this portrait of her on the wall and she leaves in the middle of the performance and I kind of take on her role. And so it's kind of very stylized and very arty. It looks very like a kind of European art film. But I do think that this kind of cliche of the female European intellectual is a nice one and should be protected. I like this kind of old-fashioned idea of an aesthete. I know women from different parts of the world, and I love that you can meet up and it doesn't matter where you're from, but you've got this kind of same sensibility, which is kind of this pre-punk idea of being artsy. But it was really important in the film that I did this portrait of her. I just think it's so enjoyable to watch people drawing or having a portrait painted. And so projected really big was just this huge face. And because it was a film from a performance, we were absolutely terrified. So we're not acting at all. We're really stiff and nervous, and you can kind of get a sense of, because if we'd just acted for the camera, we would have hammed it up and it would have been terrible. But and it meant there was a lot of pressure put on this drawing for it to be good, and it wasn't. It came out really squiffy, so yeah, there was lots of room for mistakes, or there was pressure for, or just basically the accidents get accommodated into the work. And then also at the mouth of the projection room, there was a poster to advertise the film, which also wasn't very good. And that's it. Does anyone have any questions?
Do you do any work without your collaborator now? How do you do that?
Well, that show was a solo show, but it included a lot of the film I made with her. Yeah, but otherwise, yeah, yeah.
Show without you?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm really interested in a lot of what you said, because there seem to be so many inherent dichotomies that you are pushing together. You said something about exploiting art for its voluptuousness on one hand, and there is an over-determined kind of, your interest in totalitarian regimes, totalitarian institutions. And I wonder how you merge or reconcile those two very, very different ways of thinking about art and life. I mean, maybe reconcile some of the word negotiate.
I mean, I wouldn't say the approach is straight down the line postmodern, but it's just approaching things as just things to use to talk about something that you're not even very sure of what you're discussing. They're just useful for a certain purpose. And usually they involve a certain kind of aesthetic, or there's some, of course, attachment to something about it. But
Did you just say spectacle? No.
aesthetic, maybe. But I just don't think art needs to be reconciled. As I mentioned before, what I often think is the best work is the stuff that you just get more a sense of the artist's state of mind, rather than the fact that they're trying to say something very clear about something.
I like what you just said, too, about accommodating mistakes. I mean, that seems inherent to what you just said.
Well, that's...
Not having to reconcile two different things, but, allow more organic passion.
Yeah, well, I think art has to be vulnerable, and it has to be, as long as an artist ultimately completely takes responsibility for themselves, then, yeah, there's just a lot of pressure on artists to be very kind of clear about what they're saying, of course, so that the curators can come up and put their cash card in the machine and make a withdrawal for the ideas that they want for their show or whatever. And if it's just that bit more slippy, then you've got the autonomy. And also under the kind of pressures of the commercial art world, or even just the general art world, and you've got to keep moving, to keep on top of what you're doing. Otherwise, I could be painting girls, Kornikova's arse, or, pictures of Stalin now, but of course I'm not, because it's a total process, and I've no idea what I'm going to do next, or even why. And that's the good thing about collaborating, because you get all that extra feedback and friction.
And is what you just described in terms of keeping moving, do you think that idea of looking at the means or methods that you're using, or even the imagery that you're appropriating, you've in the past said that you, or on another occasion you said that you were interested in things that were exhausted.
Yeah.
Imagery or types of imagery that were already used up and no longer useful. So you appropriate them and then they become useful to the people with the cash cards who then take your work. And then do you think that you move on to the next thing that you find that is exhausted, or do you feel like it's no longer exhausted once you've brought it into your own work?
Well, I don't think just because I've made some work about it that it suddenly becomes interesting or relevant or cool or and that's also another reason you've got to keep moving because but then that's just really part of a very linear idea to do with art and also within sort of contemporary style culture or whatever, that idea is good unless everyone likes it and then it's bad. And I like it things at that point when everyone says they're bad because they've looked like, I can't wait till cannabis is legalised because then all those kind of work that people that make work about hash, it's going to be really good because it's lost that kind of cachet of being illegal anymore. Yeah, it's the process by which something loses all that excitement of it being avant-garde or interesting. That is what I find interesting. You know, it's the way that those Russian people took that Gerhard Richter thing without even knowing, and then what that turns, how that reflects back on kind of Western art production. So it's about these, just these kind of projected transactions that make something, turn something into something else, instead of a kind of inherent quality within the subject matter. Because a lot of appropriation art relies on that.
Do you consider at all whether you're romanticizing or making nostalgic some of the images that you do bring back, sort of slightly tired, despairing Soviet?
Like, well, I remember once being criticised by someone saying, you know, all these unbelievably important movements or times or situations, you just come along and talk about how they look. And that, I thought that was a very kind of traditional kind of left-wing take on that, you know, the certain historical things that have to be protected. And I certainly wouldn't say that I've got no kind of, feel like I've got no responsibility at all to any of these things, but I just believe in the right of the artist to say whatever they want about these things and to not have to kind of justify it to left-wing academics. Because I don't think they're the custodians of our culture.
There's a difference between the Macintosh material and the Soviet, and you treat it differently too. So it seems like you are conscious of that as a person who was trained in left-wing academia.
Also, because as I mentioned about these girls and my over-identification, a lot of my response to a lot of the subject matter is completely irrational and kind of, I mean, I'll tell you a story. I had a one-night stand once with someone, and we were in bed, and he said to me, "Do you like the Cold War?" And I completely just melted. I couldn't believe it. Someone I didn't know had just managed to touch this. But of course he hadn't. He said, "Do you like the Cold Wall?" but I thought I was like, oh, I thought he'd just picked up on something. He just, that's the level that's my engagement with the subject matter.
Or something.
Have any other questions? Well, thank you, Lucy.
Oh, my pleasure.